Terror in New Orleans, questions in Las Vegas, lawmakers briefed today by the FBI here in Washington, plus a big vote tomorrow as Congress convenes. Should Mike Johnson be worrying about his future? That's Topping the Hill on NewsNation tonight.
We're going to continue to relentlessly pursue ISIS and other terrorist organizations where they are, and they'll find no safe harbor here.
They are two of the most vivacious cities in this country, and they've also started off the new year as sites of two federal investigations. A live look right there, Bourbon Street in the heart of New Orleans, back open at this moment after an ISIS-inspired terrorist took the lives of 14 people celebrating New Year's, injuring at least 35, several of whom are still fighting for their lives this evening. The FBI says a Texas man became radicalized by ISIS last year, but before then, won a Global War on Terrorism service medal. And a live look in Las Vegas tonight, no skipping a beat there, but authorities are also trying to definitively declare a suspect who was charged beyond recognition after blowing up a Tesla Cybertruck in front of the Trump Hotel. They found military identification and a passport of 37-year-old Matthew Livelsberger, a Green Beret who was on leave from his station in Germany.
We feel that the subject has been identified, although not conclusively, waiting for DNA evidence on that front. At this time, there is no information about additional subjects that the FBI is tracking on.
Now, the New Orleans terrorist attack and Vegas quote-unquote suicide mission, as authorities put it, 7 hours and 1,700 miles apart. Both men, though, happened to serve at the same military base, Fort Bragg. Both served in Afghanistan in 2009. Both rented vehicles through the same rental car app, and both attacks happened hundreds of miles from their homes. But tonight, authorities are not connecting the two.
At this point, there is no definitive link between the attack here in New Orleans and the one in Las Vegas.
A live look now, the United States Capitol here in Washington, as earlier today, on the eve of the new Congress, lawmakers from both the Intelligence and Homeland Security Committees received a briefing from the FBI. And at the White House today, President Biden receiving briefings from his national security team, the White House putting that photo out today. Hello, good evening. Welcome to Washington. I'm Blake Berman. This is The Hill on NewsNation. Our Kelly Meyer joins me here in a moment on how the White House is responding to the terror attack in New Orleans. Joe Khalil on what the FBI told those lawmakers here up on Capitol Hill today. But we begin tonight with our Alex Capriello, live in the Crescent City, back open again this evening. Alex?
Yeah, it's a remarkable thing closing in on 2 days since that terror attack to see Bourbon Street live and active once again. It had been shut down by federal law enforcement like the FBI for a little more than 36 hours, but it just recently opened up. Even still, a lot of action in terms of police, state, and federal. Look, this huge Humvee that's right here, that's Homeland Security investigators. We also see New Orleans Police Department holding the ground here on the sidewalk, not to mention a huge high-water rescue vehicle, courtesy of the Jefferson Parish Sheriff's Office, that is being used to block this intersection, Blake. So this is Canal, this is Bourbon, and this is the exact way that the truck actually came in on New Year's Day in those early morning hours, circumventing police cruisers just like this one, climbing over this sidewalk and barreling it, gunning all the way down Bourbon Street, where they just essentially slammed into hundreds of people that were out here just celebrating their New Year's Day out on Bourbon. To this point, obviously a lot has changed in the background. You can hear those sounds of the New Orleans brass band. So it seems as if, at least in this moment of time, the city is healing. But that's not to say that they don't still feel that deep level of pain and grief of the 14 people who were killed early New Year's Day morning, not to mention the 35 others that were injured. Many of those injuries also very, very severe. But at least some sense of normalcy as New Orleans gets back to what they do best.
Hey, Alex, the Sugar Bowl was the big football game there in town, which was delayed a day. What was the sense that you got as it related to folks there in New Orleans on whether they wanted it to go forward? And what was the feeling there in New Orleans, rather, around the Sugar Bowl with the security? How stepped up was it?
Yeah, Blake, I'm glad you asked that. So it's a very interesting push and pull that we're seeing both from the authorities and the officials here in New Orleans and the people who call New Orleans home, the people that have been deeply impacted by this tragedy that's happened. On one hand, the Sugar Bowl and the upcoming Super Bowl next month is a huge event that draws massive crowds and is such an economic boost for the city. But at the same time, we cannot underscore the devastation that this terrorist attack has had on this city. I personally have ties to this city. I got married here in May. My wife is from New Orleans. And so just speaking to her about it, it's kind of hard for us to see just everything get back to normal, having the Sugar Bowl on as planned as if nothing has happened here. But at the same time, we are seeing these city officials really trying to push it that everything is okay here in New Orleans, that things can go on as planned. And of course, just like New Orleans has done in the past, they will be resilient, they will recover, but it won't come without some sense of loss from what happened on New Year's Day.
Resilient is a great way to describe New Orleans, the folks from that community, that town. Alex Capriello, live for us on Bourbon Street tonight. Alex, thank you. Joe Khalil, I mentioned, was up on Capitol Hill today as lawmakers got briefed here in Washington from the FBI. What did they learn?
So it was a lot of questions that lawmakers had that, frankly, we had, which was about the suspect. A lot of the conversation focused on him in New Orleans. And the questions were, is this someone who was radicalized by ISIS or who was working at the direction of ISIS? Obviously, a huge difference. Right now, lawmakers tell me the FBI seems to think it's the former, but they're still wanting the FBI to do a little bit more work and figure out if they can eliminate that second possibility. The other thing is there this link, as you talked about, a lot of eerie similarities between the man in Las Vegas and the man in New Orleans. Lawmakers seem to think, according to the FBI, that right now there is not that link. But again, lawmakers say they were pushing the FBI to try to investigate more. Overall, they came out and they said they thought the FBI was doing a good job, which actually isn't a given from lawmakers these days. And just lastly, the senators from Louisiana left that meeting, both of them almost immediately taking to social media saying, do not be nervous to go out. It is safe. Come and enjoy yourself. Terrorist currency is fear. Don't let them win.
Let me see them getting out there on Bourbon Street. Joe Khalil with that FBI briefing. Joe, thank you. Over to the White House now. Kelly Meyer, you spent the day there at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. We saw that image from President Biden. We heard from him today as well.
Yeah, and even if we could bring that image back up of President Biden, we were there as he came back to the White House today, went right into the Situation Room. He convened a meeting with his vice president as well as his Homeland Security team. And around the desk around him, he had Mayorkas, he had the FBI deputy director, but also had the defense secretary because of the ties to the Army for both of these men. So they're trying to see what the service members' motives were here and also talk to folks that they served with to see if they know anything. So again, as Joe said, President Biden spoke at the top of his remarks this afternoon, and he said that there was no evidence of a connection that they found so far. And then as far as the attacker in New Orleans, he said that they were acting alone, which is different from what they were saying initially in the press conferences yesterday.
That was a change.
That was a change. So they said that this was someone that was acting alone. No one else was involved in the attack. And he gave more details on how the attacker placed the IEDs. And I want to play a bit of what President Biden said.
They've established that the attacker was the same person who planted the explosives in those ice coolers in two nearby locations in the French Quarter just a few hours before he rammed into the crowd with his vehicle. They assessed he had a remote detonator in his vehicle to set off those two ice chests.
So talking about the remote detonator to set those off. So that was this lone attacker. Biden says he's going to keep being briefed and keep communicating to the American people what is going on.
Kelly Meyer, live for us. Kelly, thank you. Joining us now is Charles Marino, former Department of Homeland Security advisor, former Secret Service special agent as well, back once again here on the Hill. Charles, thanks for being with us. I'm looking at the New Orleans, of course, terrorist attack, 14 people killed, more than 35 injured. And then the incident in Las Vegas as well. Both men military, both from the same base, both served in Afghanistan the same year, both used the same rental car app, both drove hundreds of miles away. At this point, it's obviously still very early, but law enforcement is not linking the two. Do you think we'll have a definitive answer on one way or another if these were connected or not? And if so, when?
Yeah, key word, definitively. I think the problem and challenge for the FBI in trying to be transparent during an early and ongoing investigation is that when you're briefing the public, it has to come with caveats, because you have to acknowledge that there could be a change in the information that's coming in. For example, with respect to the Las Vegas suspect, we have not gotten all the information back from search warrants from law enforcement on the electronic devices. That's going to be key to find out if there was any radicalization that was involved, if we're talking about mental health issues, and if there was any connection between the two suspects in New Orleans and Las Vegas. So as soon as that information comes in, I think you'll see law enforcement become more confident in concluding the investigation and their findings.
You talk about the changing of information. There was changing of information today in New Orleans by saying this person definitively acted alone. And they say they know this because they watched him on surveillance video. Were you surprised at how quick they were able to rule this out from or rule in that direction from the initial assessment?
Yeah, they were able to do so quickly. The concerning part for me is the fact that the suspect was unknown to the FBI. So
yeah, how was that? I mean, there were social media videos online.
We're still seeing a gap between social media companies working with law enforcement effectively. As we know, social media has protections under law that precludes them from being held liable for this type of rhetoric and information that's posted to their platforms. And as a result, the information sharing is not to a level that I think it should be. And the public, I think, would agree with that. This is something that was posted, predated the attack. It should have been discovered on the platform. It should be shared with law enforcement, and it should have caused enhancements to the security that had, massive gaps in it around Bourbon Street the night of New Year's Eve. So it's a problem, and law enforcement needs to close that gap with social security companies.
Well, social media companies.
Social media companies.
Real quick, Charles, I go back to what Christopher Wray, the outgoing director of the FBI, who's been in that post for 7 years or so, 7 years plus, said last year. He said his biggest concern was lone wolves drawing twisted inspiration from the Middle East. Wray said it. It happened. We just witnessed it apparently in New Orleans. Where do we go from here?
Yes, the biggest threat of lone wolves is if somebody is really planning an attack and keeping the information to themselves, not part of a larger group, they're very hard to detect, which is why you need a last line of defense that's effective at these large events, especially with public gatherings. So, there should have been an enforced perimeter around Bourbon Street that was effective. We know vehicular attacks are an attack of preference by terrorist groups. We've seen that in Germany, Spain, and other places. So there should have been preparations for that. But look, there's going to be lots of lessons learned. Hopefully jurisdictions are paying attention for how they're securing large events. And this just can't happen. But the FBI certainly has a challenge when it comes to lone wolves, especially those that become radicalized.
Charles Marino, former Secret Service Special Agent, thanks for being with us once again here on The Hill. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Blake.
Still to come here from The Hill on News Nation. 18 days, of course, until Donald Trump comes into the White House, puts forth a new FBI director. So how might his administration tackle what is apparently before us now? Plus, the new Congress getting ready to be sworn in tomorrow. Will the House Speaker Mike Johnson retain his job? And why James Carville said, you know what Jamie Dimon had to say was right. If you had been watching this show, we were telling you about it for quite some time. I'm Blake Berman. This is The Hill here on News Nation. Welcome to Washington, the center of politics. We're back in 4 minutes.
Let me be very clear about this point. This was an act of terrorism. It was premeditated and an evil act. We do not assess at this point that anyone else involved in this attack is involved in this attack except for Shamsuddin Jabbar.
That the FBI today saying that the attacker in New Orleans acted alone. Now, in 18 days, the nation's top law enforcement agency will see new leadership. Christopher Wray is leaving his post as the FBI's director at President-elect Trump's behest. Trump's nominee to replace Wray, Kash Patel, could be running the FBI if confirmed by the United States Senate. And in a post today, Trump called the FBI and the Department of Justice, quote, incompetent and corrupt. Our next guest used to lead these kind of investigations. Chris Swecker is the former FBI assistant director. He was at the agency for 24 years, joins us once again here on the Hill. It's always great to see you and speak with you, sir. Thanks for being back with us. Yes, good evening. Donald Trump wants to reform the FBI. You saw that agency at all levels over the course of 2.5 decades. How easy or not is it going to be to reform the way that Trump wants it to?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, let's understand that the FBI does need to have a certain level of independence. It's not a cabinet level position. It's an agency that should go where the facts lead them, check their politics at the door, which they hadn't done over the last 4 years, and actually starting in 2016, in my opinion. But there's a lot of good people in the Bureau. You saw that press conference in 2 sentences. The deputy assistant director who came in to lead the investigation cleared up everything and told us what we needed to know and took charge. So there are a lot of people like that in the Bureau right now. And I think, to go in there and just burn the place down is not the strategy to take going into the FBI.
So,
you have
yeah, and so Jay Johnson, the former head of the Department of Homeland Security, said today that Donald Trump should consider asking Christopher Wray to stay on through the inauguration, through the Super Bowl. You agree with him?
No, I think Chris was co-opted by the Justice Department from the day he hit the ground at the FBI. And that's natural because he comes out of the DOJ. So I think that there has to be some independence from the Justice Department. Actually, there are things that Mueller was asked to do. Director Mueller was asked to do during my tenure, and he refused to do them because he thought they were unconstitutional or unethical. And I think an FBI director has to be prepared to say that. I'm not going to do anything unethical against my oath of office. I'm going to lead this agency independently, or at least down the path of they're being apolitical, and we're going to let the facts lead us. We're not going to conduct political investigations and unpredicated investigations, and we're going to obey the law.
Christopher Wray had an insight across the board, and Chris, here's what he said in April of last year, and I want to get your reaction on the other side.
Our most immediate concern has been that individuals or small groups will draw some kind of twisted inspiration from the events in the Middle East to carry out attacks here at home. But now, increasingly concerning, is the potential for a coordinated attack here in the homeland.
He was worried about lone wolves then, and that is what we saw play out in New Orleans in the early morning hours of January 1st. How big of a concern is lone wolves as you see it?
Lone wolves are ever present. They're radicalized usually on the internet through propaganda and events in their own lives, as we saw with this recent attack, where he was in a slow motion meltdown in his life, and that sort of married up with his radical ideology. So yeah, Chris is right about that. He's also right that terrorist cells are a very important threat to keep an eye on. With 4 years of open borders, there's guaranteed that cells have infiltrated into the United States from Hezbollah, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, perhaps even Hamas.
A guarantee, you believe?
I guarantee it. It is.
How widespread?
Well, that's the problem. We should have had agents down on the border interviewing every single non-Mexican or a special interest alien that came across that border to gather intelligence. One, to vet them and know who they are. Two, to gather intelligence. We would have done that during the era that I served in the Bureau. We would have surged on the border. We did it when drug cartels became an incredibly challenging problem as probably the most profitable criminal enterprises in the world. Right. We surged on the border and we went after it. We should have had 1,000 agents down there interviewing these special interest aliens.
Chris Swecker, former FBI, got to leave it there. Always fascinating to speak with you. Thanks for being with us tonight here on The Hill.
Thank you.
You got it. I want to show you real quick the scene that's happening right now in Fullerton, California. And this comes from our Next Star station, KTLA. There is a plane that has crashed into a building there. We are told at least 11 injuries there in Fullerton, just north of Anaheim. I saw some of the video a little while ago. There was a hole and a huge presence there in Fullerton. More information as we have it. You're watching The Hill here on NewsNation. Back in a few. Welcome back here to The Hill on NewsNation. Donald Trump's victory lap ahead of his inauguration. President Biden honors January 6th committee leaders, and the House gets ready to make a big decision. Our Kelly Meyer is here with what's happening in and around the Capitol. Hello, Kelly.
Hey there, Blake. Well, a busy day on Capitol Hill. The 119th Congress will be sworn in tomorrow, and we are only 18 days away from President-elect Trump's inauguration. The inaugural committee announcing today Trump will cap off his victory lap with one last rally at the Capital One Arena here in Washington, D.C. on January 19th, just one day before his inauguration ceremony. And this will mark Trump's first rally in the Capitol since the January 6th riot at the Capitol building 4 years ago. And meanwhile, at the White House, President Biden bestowed 20 people with the Presidential Citizens Medal, which is the second highest civilian medal that honors Americans who perform exemplary deeds of service to the country. Among the honorees were Republican Representative Liz Cheney and Democratic Representative Benny Thompson, who led the January 6th committee investigation on the attack at the U.S. Capitol. And Speaker Mike Johnson continuing his fight to keep the Speaker's gavel, Trump throwing his weight behind Johnson with an endorsement this week ahead of what could be a contentious vote tomorrow. Representative Thomas Massey from Kentucky has already said he will not back Johnson continuing as Speaker. This means Johnson can only afford to lose one more vote in a narrowly divided House. And that's what's happening on the Hill, Blake.
You know, this is the fallout from the election, right? Because Republicans, they flipped the White House. Republicans, they flipped the Senate. But they only held ground in the House, and now what we saw in 2023 and in 2024 could potentially play out again tomorrow on the House floor.
And it's interesting because you see President-elect Trump trying to keep people in line, but some people aren't listening to him. They're not all staying in lockstep behind President-elect Trump. So that'll be interesting to see his power over Congress.
I don't know if you could notice there, but Kelly was sort of looking that way. She wanted to get a reaction. You know why? Because sitting next to me, Congressman Don Bacon, Republican from Omaha. Kelly, thank you very much. Appreciate it. Don Bacon, Republican from Omaha, as I mentioned, Nebraska. Hello, sir. Thanks for being with us here on the Hill. You're voting for Mike Johnson tomorrow.
Absolutely. He's done a great job. He's a good man. He's honest, a man of faith. I think he's done the very best he can with a very small majority of the last 2 years, and he deserves our support. By the way, last month, we voted, and he won a unanimous vote out of the folks who have been there and are coming in, not a single dissent. So if anybody votes against him tomorrow, I think it's a lack of integrity because they voted.
A lack of integrity?
Yes. Well, they voted for him a month ago.
But they don't like to spend. So a lot of them. So here's what the Hill's reporting. Quote, the holdouts are largely seeking promises on spending cuts and assurances that rank and file members will be involved in negotiating for high stakes legislation moving forward. You say lack of integrity, but some of these Republicans say, I'm sick and tired of the spending.
Yeah, they have to be realistic. When this vote was taken, this past month, we have a Democrat Senate, Democrat president, and I think the Speaker negotiated the best deal he could. And that's reality. Some of these guys want 100%, and if they don't get it, they want to shut the government down. It does not work. And also, these folks who are talking about spending right now, they never talk about where the big money's at. They're talking about the pennies and the nickels, but they don't talk about mandatory spending, which is the vast majority of our spending, 72% of our spending, which is contributing to the vast majority of our deficit. And I don't hear any of these folks talking about that. So they're focused on the pennies.
So some of the votes to watch tomorrow. Thomas Massey, he's already a no. Andy Harris, head of the Freedom Caucus. Scott Perry, Freedom Caucus. Folks that were showing you.
By the way, the Speaker helped out Scott Perry immensely in this last election.
So you think he owes him one?
Well, I mean, to me, it irritates the 220, the mass majority of us. We find it very irritating to have someone.
I think you're holding back here.
Oh, yeah, I'm just trying to be somewhat polite. Got to be a little diplomatic.
Okay.
But it irritates us that these people undermine our leadership, and the vast majority of us who want to get things done, but you got to optimize, you got to find consensus. if you had 220 people demanding your way on everything, you're going to get nothing done. But that's what these guys are like.
So Chip Roy said this on the House floor in the middle of the spending fight. I'll get your reaction on the other side.
Congratulate yourself because it's shorter in pages, but increases the debt by $5 trillion is asinine.
Derek Van Orden, one of your colleagues, he said, Chip and Thomas Massie did not receive a mandate for the American people. Donald Trump did, period. Get on board or get out of the way. I hear you say lack of integrity, but they are fighting for, we have got a $36 trillion deficit. Donald Trump racked up $780 billion in his first fiscal year, about $1 trillion nearly in his second fiscal year. There is a problem, isn't there?
COVID was a big part of this.
Well, that was the third. That was the third year.
Trump, yes.
Right.
And there is a spending problem, but unless you acknowledge where this state, you can eliminate all discretionary spending, all of it. You still have an $800 billion deficit, annual deficit. If you eliminate the entire defense budget, you'll have a $1.5 trillion annual deficit. So these folks aren't talking about where the real problems are at, and that's where people like me think we should have a debt commission, or we have to find ways to reform, restructure, but we got to work on the mandatory spending. And these guys are unwilling to talk about it.
But you know where this goes, because the second you say, we got to do something about Social Security, they're going to say, there goes Bacon pushing grandma over the cliff.
No, we need to do it with Democrats. Democrats got to realize this problem, too. And I work with a lot of Democrats who are willing to work with us on mandatory spending. There's Scott Peters, you got Ed Case from Hawaii, and it's got to be give and take. It can't be a Republican-only solution or a Democrat-only solution on mandatory spending. It's got to be a bipartisan solution. But when I say lack of integrity, where were these guys at a month ago when we voted for the speaker unanimously and there wasn't a single dissent or criticism? A month ago was the time to have this debate, and not tomorrow.
So let me bring in Elon Musk, because Elon Musk came in and basically hated that spending bill, and Donald Trump. Elon Musk kind of threatened primaries, and you're in a very interesting. Don Bacon's in one of the most interesting districts in this country.
Oh, I've been primary 3 times.
Okay.
So we're ready for it.
So then do you view the threat of Elon Musk as real or perceived?
Well, I think that there's some real threats, but by the way, what he said was not true. We had people on our side, and I think, unfortunately, it was Chip Roy, because that's what the president said. This is what President Trump has said. Chip Roy was feeding him false information. So, for example, Elon Musk put out that we were going to give ourselves a $66,000 pay raise. That was not true. That we were protecting Liz Cheney. That was not true. That we were going to build a new football stadium in Washington, D.C. That was not true. So a lot of things he said was not true. And they were focused on the size of the bill. We should have focused on the content. Most of that 1,500-page bill were Republican bills.
Are you hopeful? I'll leave it with this. Are you hopeful with him on Doge?
Yes. We should try to find efficiencies, waste. I'm all about that. And they even got asked about the military. I'm a big retired general, and I serve on the Armed Services Committee. I'm all for fighting efficiencies and fraud, waste in the military budget. We just don't want to reduce capability. We have big threats out there, China, Russia, Iran. But where we can find waste, by all means, I'll save the taxpayers money.
Congressman Don Bacon voting yes clearly for Mike Johnson tomorrow. Always nice to speak with you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Mick Mulvaney, someone who knows Don Bacon fairly well, joining us live from the Conch Republic. Hello, Mick. What'd you hear there?
A lot of the same discussion we've had for the last decade or so. I think Don makes some really, really good points. Look, it's going to come down to this. Who else wants to be speaker right now? That'd be my question to Don Bacon. Don, is there anybody else who can get the votes? As far as I see it, until
Hold on, let me pause you there, because Don was the congressman was about to get up, and he just sat down. Is there anyone else who can get the votes?
No. Nobody else get the votes. I would say the folks who are opposing Speaker Johnson don't even offer alternative names. And I think that's what happened with Matt Gaetz. They didn't have any alternative plans. We had a 3-week thing. So they should come in with an alternative. But I don't think there's anybody else that can do as well as Mike Johnson and get 218 votes.
All right. There you go, Mick. We'll pick it up from there.
Yeah, well, listen, I respect Thomas Massie a great deal. I served with Thomas, and Thomas has been fairly straightforward. He was the one who said weeks ago wasn't going to vote for him. And I understand the frustrations that the other fiscal conservatives have. There's no question about that. But at the end of the day, you cannot beat something with nothing. And as long as Donald Trump continues to support Michael Johnson is going to be the Speaker of the House. It may be ugly. It may get a couple of votes. It may take a while. It may really hurt some egos and bruise some friendships. But Michael Johnson right now is the only person who can be the Speaker of the House so long as Donald Trump sticks with him.
You bring up an interesting point, Mick, and it was one of the things I wanted to ask the congressman, but we got to a lot there. You know this personally. Yeah. You are alongside Donald Trump until he doesn't support you, right? And the question is, for Mike Johnson, do you believe he makes it all 2 years alongside Donald Trump? Because if then President Trump comes out and says, I don't like what you're doing, he could be out of there.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's hard to predict 2 days in Washington, let alone 2 years. But your point is well made. With the motion to vacate the speakership being as it is right now, any one person can make the motion, and then essentially a majority of the House can kick people out. And as long as that's going to be the rules, you're going to have that type of tension. That tension is natural. Keep in mind, you go back several years, Nancy Pelosi had a margin of 5 people. Kevin McCarthy had a margin of 5 people. Tight margins in the House are the way they do business these days. So look, I'm not looking 2 years down the road. I'm looking at what's going to happen tomorrow. All the Democrats expect to show up. That's important. Keep in mind, for every Democrat who does not show, that means Mike Johnson could lose another vote. And there are several Democrats who are not well. Nancy Pelosi just had hip surgery, for goodness sake. She says she's going to be there. And if all the Democrats are there, Mike can lose 1 vote. But you have to watch the Democrat aisles as much as you do the Republicans tomorrow.
All right. Mick Mulvaney, NewsNation contributor, former Trump White House chief of staff. Thank you, sir. Appreciate it. Talk to you again soon.
Thanks, Mike.
You got it. All right. Still to come here on the Hill. A new Congress sworn in tomorrow ahead of what could be that contentious vote. The full panel weighs in. And what will Trump be able to do once he's in the White House to prevent future terrorist attacks? What might his cabinet selections do? We're back in a few.
The opening day of Congress, an historic moment in America, and NewsNation politics powered by The Hill will take you there.
I'm Blake Berman. Join us for a special edition of The Hill.
Tomorrow, 6/5 Central on NewsNation.
This was an act of terrorism. It was premeditated and an evil act.
Welcome back here to The Hill on NewsNation. More details tonight on the deadly New Orleans terrorist attack that killed 14 people, injured at least 35 on New Year's Eve. The suspect is a veteran pledging allegiance to ISIS. The terror group's flag was spotted on the truck that plowed through a crowd on Bourbon Street. And then in Las Vegas, a Cybertruck there, an explosion in front of the Trump International Hotel. So how do both of these incidents revive the risk of terrorism in the U.S.? Full panel here with me now. Denise Gitsom, NewsNation political contributor. Scott Bolden, NewsNation political contributor as well. Lori Watkins is a Democratic strategist. And T.W. Origi, former communications aide to Senator Graham and Mike Pompeo. Hello to you all. Nice to have you all in. Hope you had a fantastic New Year. It was an awful start to it in New Orleans. They're not connecting these two, Scott. What happened in Las Vegas, what happened in New Orleans, but there's still lots of questions here.
Yeah, and they're still connected. Both of these people were connected to the military, which is really kind of crazy. But what have we learned from these two incidents? What did Christopher Wray tell us about these so bad actors and what keeps him up at night? And we're seeing it manifested on January 1st and New Year's Eve. And so what we learned, but more importantly, how are we going to stop it? We cannot relax with domestic terrorism or international terrorism. And it's a real problem.
This becomes Donald Trump's FBI in 18 days.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, he's going after the one that's still there right now because he's got to create that contrast. He wants to come in and show that he's a strong leader. But I just want to talk about the theme that does connect them and what you said about military. Mm-hmm. You know, we have not used the words global war on terror or talked about veteran suicide for a very long time, but over 140,000 veterans have died since post 9/11, not in combat zones. That is literally 22 times the number of veterans that were killed in combat zones, so service people. So, if we are not talking about veteran mental health, if we weren't before, and for some reason we just...
You're referring to the situation
in both situations.
Well, in Las Vegas, the authorities say that he took his life.
I mean, it's horrible.
And to build on what Denise says, 33 veterans commit suicide every single day. That number should never be that high. It should be 0, in my opinion. And with these budget fights that are about to happen, I hope to God that the veterans, that the VA is not one of the agencies that we all know has always usually on the cutting block. Because for anyone who's either active duty in the military or has separated from the military, is now having problems with transitioning into civilian life, we need to do better about this. We need to do much better about this. And the fact that Lewiston, Maine, that shooting that happened last year, that was also a person who served in our military who had troubles transitioning into civilian life. And we are not doing what we need to be doing to catch this before there's tragedies.
The terrorist attack, TW, in New Orleans is a clear case of someone being radicalized by ISIS. And again, I go back to in 18 days, there's going to be a new administration coming in, and I wonder how they try to attack it.
Yeah, well, there's experience in the Trump administration in dismantling ISIS the first time. And it was interesting what you brought up, that we don't really talk about the global war on terrorism anymore. There is a feeling that we have taken our eye off the problem of Islamic extremism. When Donald Trump brought this up today on Truth Social, right, we've had hundreds of people that from the terrorist watch list get detained crossing the border. That's going to stop. That's going to stop quick. And how many were not detained that are somewhere in this country working their cell networks that are radicalizing people like that, man? There's going to be a change.
Yeah, Chris Swecker, former FBI, told me guaranteed he believes that there's cell networks inside this country. In the meantime, the House Speaker back here in Washington, Mike Johnson, facing an uphill battle to keep his position, or at least facing a little bit of a battle. Tomorrow, the new Congress is sworn in. Mike Johnson wants that role again, Denise. He can only lose one Republican. I just had Don Bacon sitting here, Republican from Nebraska, tell me the reasons why it should be Mike Johnson. But there's a lot of folks within your party, maybe a dozen or so, who are trying to negotiate with him.
And look, they have legitimate reasons for wanting to use this as a chit for negotiation purposes, right? Like, that's how Washington is done. This is their greatest moment of glory. After this, they're just annoying again.
But if this was Democrats, you'd be saying, look at the Democratic Party in disarray.
No, I'm saying that now. The problem is not with the substance of what they're saying. The problem is how they're doing it. But here's the thing. If Speaker Johnson, or who's the only person who's going to be the speaker, isn't sworn in on time, it's going to delay Donald Trump's certification of the election. And I think every Republican knows, if they don't get that on time, there will be hell to pay, because Donald Trump is not going to put up with that kind of insurrection.
What do you think happens tomorrow?
It might go multiple rounds, maybe one or two rounds additional. Mike Johnson will be the Speaker of the House. There's no one else who can get the necessary votes. He has Trump's backing. Anyone who is trying to be a stick in the spokes of this are standing in direct opposition to Donald Trump's agenda.
Don Bacon said to me, lack integrity.
Yeah, I would agree.
You there?
I found that very interesting that he said that.
I think that's true. And look, Mike Johnson has been a good speaker. Matt Foldy from the Washington Reporter has done a great job listing the successes that Mike Johnson's delivered for conservatives of all stripes. I think it's a massive grift, and
I wonder from a Democratic perspective what you want your party to do right out the gates.
I want my party to sit back and watch this civil war unfold. We're not going to help the Republicans, or we're not going to help Mike Johnson, although we can negotiate with Mike Johnson. Mike Johnson isn't the problem. The problem with the Republicans in the House and Senate, but in the House for sure, are the 34 Democratic caucus members who won't compromise. That's the problem on the House Representative side. And so who's up next? There's nobody up next, if you will. Mike Johnson, but if you put you up, if Blake Berman, you were the new speaker,
I don't want it.
You'd have the same problem.
And I would never ever do
this
that.
This is a Republican mess.
But I think these members, these super conservatives that are throwing a monkey wrench into this whole thing, that at the same time that they're complaining, they don't know what they want, right? And what they are standing on right now of this deficit blowing up is absolutely contradictory to what we are all going to see. They're going to cut Medicare. They're going to cut the VA. They're going to cut everything
they're not cutting Medicare.
But Social Security, but defense spending. And then they're going to say, well, we had to cut it. But at the same time, they're going to reestablish these tax cuts that Trump passed. And so they're going to look like fools. But at the same time, the American people suffer. The economy, people are still going to be paying more when they go to buy their groceries, pay at the pump, etc. How is this going to help the average American?
Here's the fascinating thing. Tomorrow, we get to watch sort of the Republican Party, at least in the House, fight among themselves. And you might sit there and say, oh, my gosh, what are they doing? And you just heard from the Democrats say, oh, my gosh, look at the Republicans did win.
Yep.
And so the process
act like it then. Act like
the process starts
and run your agenda.
The process starts tomorrow, and we'll see how it all plays out.
Yeah.
Both sides. Thank you all.
Have us back tomorrow. So
Leland Vittert, host of On Balance, joins me on the other side of the break. Something James Carville said today that caught my attention. Thank you, everyone. All right, welcome back here to the Hill on NewsNation. So as Capitol Hill gets ready to start a new Congress tomorrow with a very slim majority in the House, the Democratic strategist James Carville now admitting that he was wrong about the 2024 election. There was a soundbite that I talked a decent amount about during the campaign as it related to something that Jamie Dimon said in January of last year. And we asked the question, if Donald Trump ends up winning, is Jamie Dimon basically laying out why he would win? This was a moment from our show on October 30th, just before the election. Watch.
I wish the Democrats would think a little more carefully when they talk about MAGA. When people say MAGA, they're actually looking at people voting for Trump, and they think they're voting, and they're basically scapegoating them, that you are like him. But I don't think they're voting for Trump because of his family values. Now, if you look, just take a step back, be honest. He was kind of right about NATO, kind of right about immigration. Mm-hmm. He grew the economy quite well.
Now, if Trump wins, we might ask the question, was that analysis from January spot on? All right, so fast forward. New York Times this morning op-ed piece, Carville, writing in a op-ed quote, I don't always agree with Wall Street, but Jamie Dimon was right when he said that Democrats railing against ultra-MAGA was insulting and politically tone-deaf. Leland Vittert, host of On Balance, joins me live. Leland, you got James Carville saying, you know what, Jamie Dimon was right. And we had played that soundbite time and time and time again, saying if Trump wins, that might be the reason, one of the reasons why. Carville says it was that, and he says,
well,
you know what?
James Carville only needed to listen to James.
Yeah, it's the economy stupid.
James
was
Carville
basically
only
what he
needed to listen to James Carville from how many years ago? It's the economy stupid. That is what Carville wrote above the campaign headquarters for Bill Clinton that won the election for Bill Clinton. So sometimes you don't learn anything new as you get older. Things just stay the same. What is it? The more things change, the more they stay the same?
Yeah, and fast forward here in Washington tomorrow, Republicans start to turn over this town. They'll have both chambers in the House, and then 18 days later comes Donald Trump.